Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Janne Nolan was a founding editorial board member of the Texas National Security Review. She passed away in the summer of 2019, right as I joined the journal, and unfortunately I never had the opportunity to work with her. But the words of Frank Abbott, the chair of our editorial board, I think speak volumes about her. Dr. Nolan, he says, was a giant in the national security world, writing path-breaking works on nuclear strategy and diagnosing the power bureaucracy and consensus to shape American policy. She was an amazing mentor to scores of scholars and analysts over decades. To women in the field, she was a brave trailblazer. She excelled in elite university programs, top think tanks, and policy positions, and few were better at bridging the gap. Janne's Nuclear Security Working Group did extraordinary work to convene experts and policymakers from both parties to deal with the vexing questions surrounding the bomb. No one was better at bringing people of different backgrounds together, facilitating long-lasting friendships and community. Her deep knowledge, wisdom, and guidance will be deeply missed. Volume 4, Issue 4 of the Texas National Security Review is dedicated to the legacy of Janne Nolan. The scholarly articles are taken from among the best entrants in a competition that was held to honor her work for emerging scholars. The runner-up in that competition was Dr. John Emery, author of Moral Choices Without Moral Language, which you can find in Volume 4, Issue 4 of the journal, and is up online now. Without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Emery to introduce himself.
Thank you so much for having me today, Doyle. My name is John Emery, and I'm currently an assistant professor of international security at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of International and Area Studies. I'm formerly a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at Stanford's CSAC program, and I received my PhD in 2019 from the University of California, Irvine.
Great. So, John, if you can talk to us a little bit about what's the central thesis of this article?
Sure. So this article looks at the early era at the RAND Corporation, and specifically the origins of political-military wargaming. So in the mid-1950s, people at the RAND Corporation wanted to understand how politics, economics, and psychology impacted traditional kind of style war games. So they sought to integrate these into what you would consider more traditional military style war games. And what we found there was kind of a process of contestation between the mathematics division and the social sciences division at RAND, and big disagreements over how you integrate things like politics, economics into these kind of overarching theories. And all of this, of course, is taking place in the backdrop of the rise of nuclear brinksmanship. So how do you understand the future of war when you have kind of no empirical background? And so while trying to tackle these dilemmas, their different assumptions led to different outcomes in their game, with the mathematicians quick to use nuclear weapons and the social scientists acting with a lot of restraint in their games. So the central argument really is that the social science division was able to cultivate a high degree of realism in their war game, such that it engaged the emotions of the players and led to a kind of ethical, practical judgment that caused them not to use nuclear weapons. And this had a lasting impact on all the theorists, even after the game was over.
So there's a sentence you use in there that I really liked is you talked about the question of, quote, how different epistemologies affect decision-making. And epistemology is one of those words that I confess that I know and I rarely use. And so can you refresh me on what you mean when you're referring to different epistemologies? Because I think this is a terrific way of thinking of the background, but it's also one of those words I tend to use imprecisely.
I think we all do. My first 3 years of grad school were pretty much looking up ontology and epistemology after every seminar that I had. But epistemology in its simplest sense is how we know what we know. Right? It's the philosophical wagers that we make about the world. And you can see this really play out where the mathematicians, were looking for answers to these kinds of big questions. They wanted to test these theories that they had in order to accurately predict what was going to happen in the Cold War. Whereas the social scientists took a little bit different of a stance where they wanted to cultivate a kind of understanding and recognize the role of human judgment. So it was more an educational process rather than looking for direct answers about the Cold War.
So out of curiosity, how did you come to study this question in this way? Because your article is really an article about moral philosophy and political decision-making, and yet it's set in this context of Cold War wargaming and nuclear strategy. I'm curious, what brought these together for you?
So random chance as always. I was on a panel at a digital war symposium pretty early on in my PhD career at UC Irvine. And I was on a panel with someone named Aaron Trammell, who's a professor in the informatics department at UC Irvine. And he wrote his dissertation on a kind of history of gaming and how that impacted kind of different subjectivities, especially looking at military gaming. And one of those elements was kind of early RAND Corporation. And so he kind of inspired me to go to the RAND Corporation archives and dig through something called the Cold War game. And so I really just kind of wanted to understand these kind of dilemmas of deterrence, because most of my work really focused on kind of contemporary issues of technology and ethics. And so I wanted to understand how those in the past that gained such kind of mythical stature at the RAND Corporation tackled these dilemmas of an unknown future of war, new technologies. So to kind of see it through a different lens, to gain insight into contemporary dilemmas.
So you mentioned the Cold War game, and something that I think you and I learned at the same time during the workshop as we were working on your article is that there was not, in fact, one Cold War game, but two, which giving them both the same name is a recipe to confuse future scholars. But can you talk to us about these two games and how they were different and what they sought to represent?
Sure. So the Cold War game was abbreviated the COW in the archives, which was extremely confusing for a researcher because everyone was referencing the COW. And at the time, without the help of historian Daniel Bessner, who was really crucial in helping me kind of tease out these different games and archives throughout the workshopping process of my paper, made me realize that there were kind of two separate Cold War games. First, there was one that was developed by the Mathematical Analytics Division, also known as MAD, at the RAND Corporation. But then there was kind of a spike game that was also developed that was called COW by the Social Sciences Division, because the social scientists felt that the mathematicians and economists were kind of stepping in on their turf, trying to integrate politics without incorporating the social scientists' views into kind of the construction of these games. And so you had this really kind of bureaucratic tension play out, and they were somewhat disdainful of each other. Lots of mentions of how the social scientists were operating in the 14th century with their methods and things like that from the mathematicians. But there was also some overlap and collaboration. But these two games kind of took different approaches to tackle the same issues of integrating politics into traditional wargaming.
Well, and what's interesting is, as you allude to in the introduction to your article, the reputation of RAND, and particularly of RAND Santa Monica during this period of time when people like Herman Kahn and others were working there, is very much focused on the mathematicians and this game theoretic model of nuclear war. And yet, as you detail, the lasting legacy of this process was less so the game theory and more so the model of wargaming, which is just intriguing to me. I am curious, though, you cite in the beginning of your article a satirical song, the Rand Hymn, and I was trying to fit it to a tune in my mind, and I couldn't get there. Do you happen to know the tune? Is it one we would know? I won't ask you to sing it for us.
I'm not going to sing it, and I don't know the tune, but you should absolutely check it out on YouTube. I don't think we can probably play it on here for copyright infringement, but it's Malvina Reynolds, and it's called the Rand Hymn. And it goes something like this. Oh, the RAND corporations, the boon of the world. They think all day long for a fee. They sit and they play games about going up in flames. For counters, they use you and me, honeybee. For counters, they use you and me.
And I think that's just such a wonderful way to frame the article and to introduce the next topic I really wanted to get at is this tension that runs throughout your article between what's labeled as rationality and what's labeled as morality or ethics. And there's a sentence about a third of the way into your article where you say the mathematicians were not eliminating judgment, only burying it in the operationalization of their variables. And it strikes me as someone who has watched the rise of rational choice theory in economics, as well as the rationalist school of analysis in political science, that there's great analytic leverage to be gained from these things, but oftentimes there's also a risk of doing just that, of missing what assumptions have been buried in the operationalizations. And what were the assumptions that were buried there? What is it that they took away?
So I think the best assumptions are summed up by Olaf Helmer in his opening speech of the Mad Game, where he talked about the human participating in the game acts something like an analog computer, in the sense that he takes the place of a black box into which his artificial environment feeds certain stimuli, to which he reacts behaviorally by producing strategic decisions. So it's really reducing all the complexity, all the messiness of the social world into this kind of mathematical formula that gives you kind of certainty in your answers. And I really like the social scientists' critique of this at the moment, because they said, culture, psychology, politics, emotions, these are all unquantifiable, unformalizable, and unpredictable. So they took a real qualitative approach to the development of their game. They wanted to rely on the player's qualitative knowledge of a nation's politics, its culture, its history, and human psychology, rather than this kind of abstract quantification. Because the social scientists really argued at the time that they were actually more scientific than the mathematicians, because they were reproducing the irrational dynamism of international politics. So their political simulation was a heuristic that was more scientific than other models and methods. And I think one limitation that we all can kind of recognize, and I think is especially relevant today as we're thinking about the rise of AI and computing power and war, is really the fact that our outputs and our answers to questions are only as good as our assumptions that go into it. Right? So if you have really bad mathematical models or make really bad assumptions in your operationalization, the answers aren't going to be necessarily very helpful to you. There was one engineer at the Rand Corporation who didn't really make it in the paper, but his name was James Digby, and he became the head of the operations department at Rand. And he was kind of really my Virgil throughout the process of the archives, because he is a researcher's dream in that he saved every single memo, every single document, every letter that he was CC'd on. So he was really kind of my guide. But he was thinking through these things and was very reflexive about the limitations of science, even as an engineer. And so he talked about how there were gaps in our knowledge of enemy equipment and tactics, wide variations in observed results, even in our own forces, fluctuating factors like weather involved, and other situations that don't have real peacetime precedents. In the end, because of all this, we think it's wrong to go into great detail, he says, on one factor only to multiply it by another that is so vague that the philosophers debate whether it could rightly be called a probability. In fact, we're coming to the opinion that too much emphasis is placed on the numerical outputs of broad system studies, measures like total bombers shot down, cities destroyed, total bombs on target, and so on, rather than the things that actually play into it. And so I think that kind of reflexivity of James Digby shows that there are real limitations in our understanding of both our enemy and ourselves in something as complex as war.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciated as you were discussing some of the unforeseen complexity is the frustration that arises in dealing with it. Because while the systems on the MAD version were operating in reliably predictable ways, in the SSD version of the game, different players would not always act in the way that others expected. And in Frank's appreciation of Janne Nolan, he mentions that she was a Simpsons fan. There was an episode of The Simpsons I love where Homer went to work for the James Bond-style villain, and at one point in testing a super weapon, he asks Homer, "Hey, Homer, who do you like less, Italy or France?" Homer says, France. And the villain, Max Scorpio, says, "No one ever says Italy." But this dynamic played out again in the SSD game, didn't it?
Absolutely. So some of the elements of the SSD game that I think were really interesting is that, and took a lot of the players by surprise, was the European team, especially the French team, caused the US players so much grief. So there was a real instability of the French commitments and fluctuating composition of its government that the US team found it really frustrating, just as the US found the French pretty frustrating in reality as well at the time. So the game succeeded on reproducing almost too well the tensions, divergences, and shakiness of the NATO alliance and the French in particular. And so this analysis, especially, they drew that was a useful product of the game that brought up issues such as the U.S. Offer a sharing of nuclear weapons and delivery systems and modern weapons. So it really had an impact in kind of understanding policies and how to deal with kind of wavering French commitments to the NATO alliance at the time.
And, I think one of the things that I appreciate very much about the tension that's set up in your article is that it's a tension that's echoed in many other ways. I mean, if fans of Star Trek will recognize in the tension of SSD versus MAD, the tension between Kirk and Spock, right? This idea of what is the role of emotion versus logic in reason and decision making. And I'm curious, was there an outcome? Did Rand ever come to a conclusion on which outcomes were preferable, which games they felt to be more reliable indicators of what was going to happen there?
Rand kind of abandoned both games, somewhat ironically, just because they were far too time-consuming. So, for example, the fourth round of the SSD game lasted 2 full weeks. Everyone devoted full time to it. They brought in people from the State Department, and it was really intensive. So they viewed it not as necessarily cost-efficient for what they were trying to do. But there is this real tension that comes out here between reason and emotion. It's something that feminist scholars in IR have been unpacking for decades. But I think reason and emotion can't be separated. This is kind of one of my philosophical positions that I stake out. And I think emotion is really central to us, especially to our decision-making, both in the kind of fears and tensions that go on when we have to kind of tackle these high-level decisions. But simultaneously, emotions help us to act morally. They inform our moral intuition, they generate empathy, they hold us accountable for our choices, and can guide us toward more ethical behavior. And so what we saw in the MAD is that they were really quick to go and use nuclear weapons a few times because the world was so abstracted. There was no level of realism in the play that they were playing, so that they didn't even think or contemplate the idea that this could kill millions, right? Whereas in the SSD, this was kind of at the forefront of their mind. It took a huge emotional toll on the players and had a big lasting impact on them. And it actually had a cooling effect on all of them. And so if you'll allow me this one quote, this is kind of the essence of the argument from the SSD game. And this is W.P. Davison reflecting on that game. He says, "But most of all, the players quickly gained a sense of the awful consequences that might result from an ill-advised move. In the game, as in the real world, international relations were conducted under the shadow of the terrible destructiveness of modern weapons. Participants acquired a sense of crushing responsibility, and for this reason the game was sometimes exhausting. As a result of this sense of responsibility, players often tended to be extremely cautious. Those who in the classroom or in publications may have advocated bold, imaginative policies and criticized free world leaders for timidity usually found themselves behaving with equal caution when they assumed the burden of policymaking in the game. Participants thus tended to judge foreign policy decisions in the real world differently than they had before it." So it had this real emotional toll that made you question and push back against even your own assumptions that you may have advocated for in writing. And the fact that it was well beyond the game, I think, is something really important, which is why I think this game proliferated kind of so successfully to the State Department, to MIT, and beyond.
Your talk about the emotional toll also, I think, raises one of the other issues that I really appreciated, which is the use of language as a way of diminishing the horror and reality of what was being done. And I love that you engage with Carol Cohn's classic article here, but there's a type of ironic gallows humor in much of the language. The very, very fact of referring to the division as mad and to the games as cow on questions of such extraordinary import. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that. How, especially in the mathematical game, was language used to make contemplatable things that are just horrifying?
Yeah, I think language structures our reality in so many more ways than we're often aware of. And so obviously Carol Cohn had a big impact on me and my thought, and her Sex and Death in the Rational World of the Defense Intellectual is my favorite article to teach both undergrad and grad students. And she really captures this notion of techno-strategic language and the power that it has in her participant observation study in the late 80s. You take something like the concept of limited nuclear war. Thankfully, something like that has never taken place. So in the end, we have to create and construct these quote unquote rational worlds where we model how a limited nuclear war might play out in the end. This idea that we would have hypothetical, calm, rational actors that could make decisions free of emotion, free of political pressures, free of the desire for revenge, free of madness or despair. So to enter into this rational world, so to speak, is an abstracted one that's really removed from reality, and it's judged by its internal logic rather than what might happen empirically in the world. So I think engaging emotion in this kind of way is so important to understanding how things might play out in the real world rather than just kind of abstract scenarios. So language in the end really structures our reality in a lot of ways, and it has the effect to allow you to casually discuss tens of millions with no sense of horror, no sense of urgency or kind of moral abhorrence to that prospect. And so with the MAD, they had no problems launching weapons and killing tens of millions because it was too abstract. Whereas in the SSD, it became a little bit more real just because of that absence of abstraction.
And I think mathematics also serves as its own form of language there. You have a table in the article that includes their estimates of population loss, economic capacity loss, et cetera, based on particular types of nuclear launches or exchanges. And there's a tendency to look at and say 30%, okay, until you ask 30% of what? And boy, that what is a big number comprised of a lot of humanity.
Right. And I think the issue here especially is that numbers give us a false sense of certainty and the unpredictability of something like war. Right? War is the ultimate experiment in catastrophe. Right? You throw everything up in the air and see where it lands. And we're really bad at predicting how wars are going to play out in the end throughout history. And so I think the kind of allure of mathematics is it gives you these kind of concrete answers. But even so, we're really bad at predicting even something as simple as like casualty estimation. Lynn Eden, in her book, The Whole World on Fire, noted that up until the 2000s, our casualty estimations of nuclear weapons only included blast damage and not damage from fire, which was a known effect of nuclear weapons. And so even our rational calculations are based on a lot of these assumptions, and it engages a language that necessarily wouldn't take place in the real world. So it gives you this illusion of certainty.
Yeah, I would commend Eden's book to our listeners as it's fascinating because it is emotionally powerful because of the sobriety of its analysis. And it does a thorough and devastating job in outlining, in part based on the experience from the bombings at the end of World War II, as to the anticipated effects of fire as just one component of the effects of nuclear weapons. But it's an excellent and disturbing read, not the sort of thing you want to read right before bedtime.
No, definitely an early morning read to ruin the rest of your day.
I'm curious, though, with this question of language, because we see this trend of sterilizing language, not only in discussing things at the very high end of the conflict spectrum, but certainly over the past 20 years at the very low end of the conflict spectrum. We've talked about neutralizing terrorists. We've talked about finding, fixing, and finishing targets. We've talked about stability operations. We talk about things with a sort of sterile vocabulary. And I'm wondering if you think there's any parallel between the sterility of the language used in the nuclear analysis and perhaps the disconnect between the outcomes there and those that seemed more likely to hold in the real world, and perhaps the same sterility and the surprises we've experienced with the outcomes in Afghanistan and Iraq.
So I think on the one hand, we tend to use sterile language because, rightfully so, it's difficult for us to kill and take life. We have this moral aversion to it. So to some extent, one of the burdens we ask our soldiers to take on is to kill in the name of our political community. And one way that you're able to do that without huge moral injury is by taking on this kind of sterile language. But I think one of the kind of damning effects of it, especially in the contemporary era, is that we have this tendency to humanize insentient weapons, something like the drone especially. We almost give it a godlike omniscience. And we dehumanize those that are killed, right? We talk about precision strikes, surgical strikes, and it gives you this illusion. And the problem is that it gets you to focus on the technology used to kill rather than those being killed, right? It's very easy for you to kind of dismiss and talk about something like 10 million casualties when it comes to nuclear weapons without this kind of moral abhorrence. And so you can see things like gallows humor or distancing as well that really has an impact on the way you frame things.
Yeah, and I think even the use of the phrase "the bomb," which certainly is a very dated phrase that I think we associate with the period of these games, is a great example of that sort of humanizing and making sentient something that is not sentient to focus on the technology rather than the effects.
Right. If you'll allow me, one of the examples that I tend to use in my lecture on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to really kind of show the disconnect between large numbers and that kind of human element. So when we're talking about the casualties at Hiroshima, Alex Wellerstein broke down the kind of numbers when we're thinking about the casualty numbers from Hiroshima. And he says the United States military estimated that around 70,000 people died at Hiroshima, though later independent estimates argued that the actual number was 140,000 dead. In both cases, the majority of the deaths occurred on the day of the bombing itself, with nearly all of them taking place by the end of 1945. Then I contrast that with Iko Tori, who was 21 when the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. She was riding in a streetcar with her infant child after being thrown to the ground from the blast, and she recalls, "I held my son firmly and looked down on him. We'd been standing by the window of the streetcar, and I think fragments of glass had pierced his head. His face was a mess because of the blood flowing from his head, but he looked at my face and smiled. His smile has remained glued in my memory. He did not comprehend what had happened, and so he looked at me and smiled at my face, which was all bloody after being thrown from the streetcar with him in my arms. I had plenty of milk, which he drank all throughout the day. I think my child sucked the poison right out of my body. And soon after, he died. Yes, I think he died for me." You can see there that chill that you get when you hear that kind of firsthand account of the impact of nuclear weapons versus that kind of abstract notion of 70,000, 140,000 died. It evokes that emotional response in us. And that's, I think, why the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, focused so early on the humanitarian conferences and the humanitarian elements of these nuclear weapons that often get sidelined in the quote-unquote rational discussions of deterrence.
Yeah, and I think those two contrasting quotes highlight very well if the purpose of the use of sterilizing language and of assumptions and mathematical algorithms was to move past the horror in order to be able to plan for the employment, then it kind of missed the point. Is if you can't consider the horror, then you can't effectively or accurately plan for the employment.
Precisely. You have to confront that horror head on. And so I think that's why the emotional element of the war game in the SSD model is so powerful, that they were forced to confront those things that before had been abstract. And so for many, it kind of left them even with a hangover almost for days after of the emotional toll that it takes, because decision-making, especially at the highest levels, does have that emotional element. You recognize the weight and burden of decision-making in a way that you don't necessarily have to when you're sitting at your desk writing a paper on it.
You would certainly hope that the decision-making at that level carries that burden at any rate.
Fingers crossed. I'm not optimistic on that sometimes, though.
So one of the things that I think makes your article unique is the way, as I mentioned, in which you combine questions of moral philosophy with questions of nuclear strategy. And in particular, you focus on Aristotelian philosophy and the idea of practical wisdom, or phronesis. And this is one of those concepts that both makes sense and is immensely frustrating, right? Because it's the idea that, okay, I've got all this stuff. I'm trying to figure out the right path. And what do I use to do it? I use practical wisdom. Well, okay, thanks. That's not especially helpful. How did the players of the SSD game at Rand navigate this path of practical wisdom, and how did they implement it?
Well, I think my use of Aristotle, is really kind of central because I want to push back against the notion that ethics is an algorithm or that you can just follow a rule or make a utilitarian calculation with some degree of certainty, especially when it comes to war. Because Aristotle treated ethics not as an abstract science, but a field of practical wisdom. So you must understand the particular circumstances of the case and exercise practical judgment within that. So it is frustrating, but I think it's important to understand that you can't make abstract rules to apply to every situation. You're going to have dilemmas that really you need to understand the concrete case of what's going on there. So take a contemporary dilemma like something of humanitarian intervention. You have two ideas in radical tension, the saving of innocents and perhaps at home democratic values where there's no will of your population to intervene. Which one is the higher moral obligation here? And the kind of notion of tragedy is that there's no easy answer. There's no one rule that you can follow. It's really dependent on the circumstances, where you might have to give up democracy on the one hand, or you might have to give up something like humanitarian intervention. And so the SSD really tried to cultivate judgment of their players throughout the game. The MAD, in contrast, wanted to eliminate judgment from the game entirely. They wanted to have predictable inputs and predictable outputs, such that judgment was only exercised in the game design itself. Whereas the SSD really focused on utilizing all the players' expertise, be it on a region, be it on nuclear weapons, in order to exercise that judgment to make the best decisions under these conditions of uncertainty and under conditions of kind of tensions that present themselves in the real world. So understanding the value of expertise and not treating humans like an analog computer.
Yeah, and I think, again, the title of your article does a great job of expressing this, is that the choice to approach the problem in that way by the mathematics division was not a choice that removed or abstracted morality. It was a choice that placed a particular value on morality, a very low one in this case, and proceeded based on that assumption. And it's interesting because while it's not common in academic discourse, in popular discourse of realism, you often hear the sort of idea that realpolitik is valuable because it's not constrained by moral considerations, as if morality is a luxury good to be used only at times when it's not interfering with your policy objectives. And my perspective is that it seems that it's not that it gets rid of it. It just places a value on it. There is no such thing as an amoral policy. There's simply a policy where your value of the considerations associated with morality is different than that of others.
Right. Even taking that realist position, you're staking an ethical claim. Even if you say that you're kind of transcending ethics, I argue that you never can. And the kind of great irony and why it's called moral choices without moral language is because they didn't really talk about morals or ethics, or they didn't talk about these things at the Rand Corporation, or really a lot throughout the Cold War in general, right? These were excluded from discussions as kind of irrational, right? And so it was viewed as something to be held privately, not something that you would bring up in public. And so you're trying to search for the kind of silences of the archives. And it comes out when they talk about the kind of emotion of the game and how they viewed things differently. But really, I'm making the claim here that this engagement with emotion of the players is getting at their ethical intuitions, right? It's getting at something that they don't articulate in a certain way because rationality is that dominant discourse at the time. But it's something that they held in private and had to deal with privately. So one anecdote from Fred Kaplan's The Wizards of Armageddon talks about when they were first trying to understand the implications of the hydrogen bomb. There was a 4-man team there, Ernst Plessett, Charlie Hitch, Jim Lipp, and Bernard Brody, that were drawing lay-down circles to basically calculate what a 5 or 10 megaton bomb, what kind of damage it would do to something like the Soviet Union. And they calculated that even under the best of circumstances, 35 million Soviets would be killed if we launched some nuclear weapons on their largest cities. And initially for these individuals, it was a rather mechanical task. But shortly thereafter, they began to realize that it was no longer so mechanical. Never before at this time had anyone killed 2 million people on a sheet of paper before. So Charlie Hitch went home, and his wife called up John Williams, the director at RAND at the time, his wife, and said, "What are you doing to them there at RAND? Charlie comes home, he's uncivil, he's depressed, he locks himself in his study and drinks. And Jim Lipp was so flabbergasted at the prospect of killing 2 million that he nearly threw up and asked to be taken off the project. So early on, you can see this real moral aversion to the act of killing, even in an abstracted sense, millions of people. And so I wanted to see how that played out in this kind of concrete case.
So even as we've been discussing some fairly weighty and at times depressing topics, like the idea of killing 2 million or 35 million people in a nuclear exchange, at the same time, there's a tale of hope that comes out of the research that you did in the archives. And I think it's interesting. What was the lasting legacy of these games in terms of what continued forward? What piece of them?
So there was a kind of great tragic irony here that the social scientists were really marginalized at RAND, but their game did proliferate and have a lasting impact on both the theory and practice of international politics, according to historian Daniel Bessner. So right after this game, they kind of abandoned the SSD game at the RAND Corporation. It proliferated to the Social Science Research Council, the State Department, West Point, the Army War College, Yale, Princeton, and most kind of iconically MIT, where Lincoln Bloomfield took on these games, and Reed Pauly's study in international security, Would Leaders Press the Button, tackled and examined kind of 26 of these political military war games that were played between 1958 and 1972. So you see how it proliferated and really impacted both high-level decision-making at government levels, but also in the academic circles as well. So their method of gaming and integrating politics and all of these other elements into what was traditionally, tactical or strategic wargaming had a real lasting impact. And even to this day, thankfully, we're seeing this great renaissance in wargaming taking place in the social sciences and beyond, to where we're engaging this to tackle the kind of dilemmas of the unknown futures of war.
So there's one anecdote that I especially appreciated that's almost a throwaway line in your article. You mentioned that the records of the 1954 game were kept, including a recording, but that there was no device at RAND capable of playing the recording that was made. And it made me think of recording things forever on VHS or similar sorts of safekeeping. So I'm curious, what was your favorite experience or anecdote working in the archives for this article?
So, yeah, that was one of the kind of most frustrating things a little bit, is that they took the time in the Mad game to record absolutely everything. But it's not easy to get your hands on a device to play 1953 recordings. And so Reed Pauly and I have been in conversation to try and finagle one of those devices and maybe get back and kind of give transcriptions to give us a bit more detail. But we did have a pretty good analysis of the impact of the games and the kind of speeches before and after to give us a good sense of what went on there, even in the absence of listening to hours and hours of that. And so the archives were an absolutely fascinating kind of endeavor to kind of immerse yourself in that moment of time and really try and understand from their perspective how they were dealing with it. And so, admittedly, I went in thinking RAND was filled with a bunch of Dr. Strangeloves that were happy to, kill millions. But what I found really surprised me, and I think that act of surprise is so fundamental to the research process, right? That moment of surprise where you recognize that it wasn't just this kind of monolith. There was immense contestation going on there, and it played out between these two divisions. And so you can see anytime there's a policy you don't like and you look back in history, you can see someone fighting against it. And I think that gives me a little bit of hope, too, that you can see this process of contestation, that sometimes things that we think win out in the end, like, game theoretic models for Cold War deterrence, this social scientific model still had a lasting impact in the proliferation of its game model.
And as I recall, there was a significant difference in outcome between the game theoretic model and the social scientific model, correct?
Correct. So the game theoretic model, they were quick to use nuclear weapons. In one game, they launched hydrogen bombs almost in the first move between the US and Soviet Union that the Middle East took over. And in the social science division, they never used nuclear weapons. They were very restrained in that. And that's something that Reed Pauly found in his games that Lincoln Bloomfield ran at MIT as well, that there was a real hesitation to cross that nuclear threshold. Only 2 out of the 26 games at MIT even launched nuclear weapons. And when they did, it only happened at a time when U.S. troops were threatened with serious defeat, and the participants regretted what had happened. So one participant reflected that it's sobering and disturbing to realize that a handful of men in the United States and the Soviet Union can decide the fate of hundreds of millions, including many not in either country. So you can see the weight and emotion and the power that games can have if you have this high degree of realism and engage in this process of physical play to really shape a new conversation when we're thinking about the impact of nuclear weapons or possible futures of war.
And I think that's an interesting note to end on, because as you mentioned, Europe was very much a theater concern when these games were being played, and the primary adversary was the Soviet Union. In recent weeks, in addition to concerns about Russia and their resurgent military power and their upcoming military exercise, we've also read news of a substantial new number of Chinese ICBM silos. And there's been talk of questions of extended deterrence related to North Korea, to Japan, even perhaps to Taiwan, where no formal deterrent assurance has been made. And I wonder, how appropriate do you think wargaming is as a tool to help explore the issues that are associated with this new strategic environment that confronts us? And what are the limitations or cautions we should consider in doing so?
So I think wargaming is especially useful in helping us to think through possible scenarios, right? You can never fully account for everything. There are things that come out of the blue that are somewhat unpredictable, but at other times you can think through how an enemy might react, how you might react to that reaction, et cetera, and kind of play through that. And I think if you use wargaming as this tool, it can lead to kind of an educational benefit to help you to understand how to exercise judgment in the face of uncertainty. I think where wargaming can get dangerous is if you think it can predict the future in a certain way, that the world will end up the way you've modeled it in the game, I think is a dangerous way of conceptualizing it. But the vast majority of wargamers that I've had the privilege to speak to really recognize those limitations and understand the kind of value of wargaming, both at the decision-making level, but also, even in the classroom to get students to think through these in new and novel ways.
John, thank you so much for joining us on this. As I told you before we started recording, I've read this article several times now in the editing process, as well as, again, in preparation for the podcast. And each time I read it, I find something else to admire in it. I really, really think highly of this article, and am delighted to have it as the first scholarly article we post in the special issue devoted to Janne Nolan's legacy. So thank you for the article, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.